The last aspect of private life in the Victorian society to consider today is death and mourning. Mourning, Mourning, not morning as early in the day, but very elaborate social customs connected with death, with funerals, with grieving, with showing respect to the people who died. And if you know anything about Victorian culture, almost all deaths, except for accidents really, happened in the home. Hospitals were not the places that the upper crust of the society would go to. The state of the medicine was not very good to begin with, but generally, whoever could afford to care for the ill at home did that. So the doctor was called to visit the patients at home rather than the patient would be admitted to a hospital. Uh, so most almost all deaths happened at home. After the person died, the eyes were closed, and everybody was still preparing for the funeral. There were some mm, aspects of death that were very important to the Victorians that are probably not as important today. One was the threat, the fear of being buried alive. This was a massive Victorian fear, and there were all kinds of horrible stories circulated about bodies being discovered in some old cemeteries when the coffins were moved, suggesting that these people woke up in the coffin and they suffocated. They tried to save themselves, but there was nobody there. Perhaps it happened more often than today that doctors mistakenly took a patient in the coma to be dead, but it wasn't really a frequent occurrence, definitely not as much as the Victorians believed it to be. So much so that there were all kinds of inventions used um, to prevent such an incident from happening. So, one of the early uses of electricity was to install alarm bells in the coffins that could be operated from inside the coffin. So, if the supposedly dead person woke in the coffin, after all, they could sound the alarm, and there would be someone like a watchman employed at the cemetery to listen for those alarm bells and rescue the uh, unfortunates who were buried alive before they suffocated. So this was one of the great Victorian fears concerning death. Another one was the fear of the body being kidnapped and sold to medical students for practice. Uh, this happened, but not really in the Victorian period, but earlier. At the beginning of the 19th century, before Victoria's reign, especially in Scotland, where there was a lot of medical students and not enough bodies for dissection. There were some criminals, the so-called body snatchers or resurrectionists, who would actually steal the coffins or steal the corpses and sell them to medical students. Sometimes they would even murder people to obtain the bodies to be sold to medical students. This was not the case during Victoria's reign. There were actually some legal arrangements to provide bodies for dissection, mostly the bodies of criminals who were executed, and the bodies of paupers who died in the workhouse. If the family could not afford the funeral, such a corpse was indeed given over to medical students. But the crime of body snatching was no longer, I would say, profitable. So hardly anyone tried to do it in the Victorian period. However, the memory, the cultural memory of such incidents happening in previous decades created a kind of panic among the Victorians. So generally, uh, if a death happened in a Victorian home, the body was constantly guarded by someone, a member of the family, or a servant, or some kind of watchman, or before the funeral. One reason was to look for any possible signs of life, so that the person was in a coma and not dead, and the other possibility was to prevent the crime of body snatching. Uh, so there were all kinds of social customs connected with death, especially in richer families. So after there was a death in the house, all the windows were opened, but the blinds were pulled down. The reason was really connected with the custom we already discussed, the customs of calling. So if some acquaintance wanted to pay a visit, they would notice this very irregular arrangement of windows, and this was a sign to the outsiders that there was a death in the house. So unless you were close acquaintance, you would refrain from the visit. So that was quite popular thing. The ceremonies concerning death and funerals were extremely important for the Victorians. So much so that even poor people had some kind of savings banks organized. So there were private institutions in which you could economize, uh, put aside a bit of money every week or every month when you were paid. So when a bulk of money was needed for a funeral, you would be paid this sum for the funeral. This was believed to be more important than having a ceremonial wedding. Really, death was very important for Victorian culture. You have to remember that not only old and ill people died, they did not have antibiotics, so any kind of infectious disease, any kind of illnesses that are not dangerous today could actually um, result in a death also of young people. Children died at a much higher rate than today. Women in childbirth died at a much higher rate than today. Some say that 1 in 10 women in the Victorian society died from childbirth complications. So if they had many children, this was quite a risk. The funerals were very important, and also what happened after the funeral was very important. This was a very important part of all kinds of behavior manuals, etiquette manuals, how to behave, and how to show the respect for the person who died, mostly through appropriate clothes, the so-called mourning clothes. So this was a very complex system of wearing special fashions and special colors, mostly black, but also other dark colors for the families of the person who died. So the strictest rules of mourning, of course, were for the widows. So the shortest possible period of mourning for widows was 1 year in the strictest mourning, wearing only black collars covering the face very often. There could be some delicate white touches like a collar or a headdress, but otherwise the clothes had to be black. And if you know anything about Victorian fashion, Victorian women did not wear black as a fashionable color. It was not a fashionable color. It was not considered, I don't know, sexy or slimming or sophisticated. No. The only way to wear black in Victorian culture was mourning. So if somebody died and you wanted to express your respect for the dead. Then for another year or sometimes two, the widow was supposed to wear half mourning, so not only black but other dark colors, dark gray, dark brown, dark purple, other dark colors as well. Uh, this was not only for widows, so there was like a whole table mostly in those behavior manuals. Depending on your proximity to the person who died, the exact length and type of mourning was advised. So, for example, for the death of a parent or a child above the age of 7, you had to mourn for a year. Mourning for young children was shorter because they died like flies, basically. Um, and a little piece of trivia, because I once looked through such a manual and I thought, what would be the last position on the list? Like, how far in proximity you should be to the person who died to mourn them at all. So the manual I looked through had the last position like this. So imagine yourself being a mature woman with a grown-up daughter who's married herself. So if your daughter's mother-in-law dies, you mourn for 3 months. Not the strictest mourning, but the half mourning, but for 3 months. So this could really have quite a wide circle of acquaintances. And of course, if there was a death in the royal family, especially if a monarch died, everybody mourned. So when Queen Victoria died in 1901, everybody, basically everybody, mourned for 3 months. She died in late January, and her successor, King Edward VII, decided that perhaps it was enough of that around Easter time, so like 3 months later. And there were many voices in the press and public opinion that it was too early, that they should have stayed longer in mourning. Uh, and I'm not talking about the family, I'm talking about the subjects of the Queen. So this was really something very important in Victorian culture. Something that was performed regardless of your material status. This was perhaps the aspect of Victorian culture that was not so much class related, because it was so important that even working class people, especially working class widows, had to conform to the mourning rituals, especially if they hoped for some public assistance in their reduced circumstances. So basically, it was considered obligatory to wear mourning clothes if you were a widow. And if you did not do it, for whatever reason, this was a massive breach of etiquette in Victorian world. Probably the greatest breach of etiquette imaginable. You risked being completely ostracized by by the society. So that's really something that happened. Next week we'll talk about leisure and pleasure and holidays, sports, and such. So thank you for this week. Thank you for my husband for holding the camera, and see you next week.